right, so just wanted to do a little debrief on my check ride. So yesterday had my private pilot check ride, went out to Apopka and went through a check ride with my DPE. So it started off with 30 to 45 minutes worth of paperwork. What I had was a nice binder going, so that's one thing I would definitely recommend. Had a binder, everything tabbed with things like my hours all written out, totaled up. I did print up a logbook, but the DPE didn't want to use that. He actually used my iPad and ForeFlight directly. But what I had was the POH handy, and a PDF on my laptop, so I could just pull that up and use that as I needed. So it started out with some scenarios, things like you're flying some friends to a baseball game, they want to help pay for it, how much can they pay, that kind of stuff. Ask some questions about what airspace I would be flying over, under, things like that on the way. At one point he pulled out ForeFlight again and said, you want to go from this point to this point, can you do it? There was a restricted area in that flight path, so obviously I told him I couldn't do that. He said, all right, great, you want to move it over here, can you take that flight? That goes over a MOA, can you do that, kind of thing. So after some of those questions, he got into things like angle of attack and critical angle of attack, what causes a stall. Asked me things about lift, what causes lift, and I kind of went over the Bernoulli principle, but also kind of mentioned that there's a question about whether or not that is actually accurate, and kind of talked about Newton's law instead. So after kind of talking through some of that, he started, this is all scenario based, so he started giving me more scenarios, things about, if I'm flying to a certain airport, how do I calculate how much fuel, so going into the POH, talking about altitude and fuel requirements and what RPM we'd be using. He asked me about a spin and how I would recover from a spin if that were to happen, what causes a spin, what's the recovery process of that. Got into my logbook, and I have kind of built my own logbook in a database application called FileMaker, so I went through that with him. I also had it in ForeFlight, so kind of compared the two of those, kind of talked through how I came up with the numbers, wind correction angle, demonstrating, on the E6B, how I came up with the wind correction angle. He asked about crosswind component, how, another scenario, you're coming into land and you have to land on this runway with this wind. How do you calculate that? So I had the manual E6B, so I pulled that out, looked at the wind correction, and came up with a number, and he had it on his iPhone. He had the E6B app, and so he did his calculation, and I was, within 0.3 or so of his number, so that was acceptable. He did tell me at the start of it, he said, if I don't stop you or say you're wrong or anything, just assume that you've got it right. And he said he can't answer any questions about whether or how I'm doing. Did I get that right or wrong? He just kind of had to take notes. So, kind of went over the flight plan, what altitude, why, pulled up the weather briefing. So we stepped through the ForeFlight weather briefing, and he asked me questions at each step of that. So, what does it mean for the PIREP? Can you read the METAR? And I started talking about decoding it, and he says, it was interesting. Some of the videos I've seen, they said don't use ForeFlight weather. You have to talk about how you went to WX Brief and got all your information. He actually said, why wouldn't you use ForeFlight? That's what you're going to use when you're flying. I was decoding everything correctly, but then went over the fact that it can decode it and put it in plain English for you, and that was acceptable. So we continued on from there. Some of the questions he was asking, I didn't have the answer off the top of my head. So he said, you can look it up, but where are you going to look? What's the name of the publication? So I use Sporties. I actually pulled up my Sporties app, went into the FAA publications section and pulled up the PHAK, the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, went and found the section that he was looking for and gave him the information. So there are pieces there that you can look up. He did mention you can't Google it. You have to know where to look, know how to find it without just searching in Google. So kind of went through all of that, which was good. A couple more scenarios came up just to kind of test to make sure, what my decision making would be if we were flying somewhere and, it was possibly going to be overcast or raining when we got there. Would I still go? Looking up my alternate airports, what the runway length is, make sure I understand how to look up all those pieces. It just so happened yesterday that the Tallahassee airport that we were flying to had runways closed during the time we would have been arriving. So I kind of went through that, looked at the wind. Based on yesterday's wind, the runway that was closed wouldn't have been in use anyway, so that was good. I told them, yes, we could still go because we'd be landing directly into the wind in this situation, and perfect. So kind of, a lot of that stuff, a lot of the scenarios, kind of just making sure my decision making was where it needed to be. I mentioned to him, if I finish this, I'd be flying with my wife, my kids possibly. And he, kind of made the statement. He's like, I'm testing to see if I would trust you to fly my wife, and I like her. So it was funny. He was kind of keeping it lighthearted at certain times, but definitely grilling me, which I told him I appreciated, because I don't want to be handed something that I don't deserve and that would put my family at risk. So that was great. So then, that probably was 2.5 hours that, and then I heard the words I was waiting to hear, which is, let's go fly. So that was awesome. Packed up all the books, went over, did the pre-flight on the airplane. He didn't really have any questions about that. So that, that was good, because, I guess he understood I knew what I was doing as he watched me pre-flight. Got in the airplane, did my, startup, did my safety briefing with him, explained the seat belts and the fire extinguisher and how to open the door, all that kind of stuff. Taxied out to the run-up area, did my run-up, and went through the another briefing with him, just telling him, if anything happens as we're taking off, if we're still on the runway before our V-speed, I'm just going to kill the engine, come to a stop, below 1,000 feet, look for a place straight ahead to land. And if it's over 1,000 feet, we'll turn back, troubleshoot, or just come back in for a landing. So he had me start out my cross country. I started to tune in the OBS or GPS. He said, nope, look at your paperwork. We're going to, basically pilotage dead reckoning. So just using my printout that I made out of my application, I just turned in the heading I needed, started my timer on the clock there, and told them it's 10 minutes to our first checkpoint. It's going to be Leesburg Airport on our left. Just kind of flew at my desired altitude. 10 minutes in, looked over to the left, there's my airport. So that was check one. Started the next leg of it, got maybe 3-4 minutes into that, and he said, okay, that's good enough, let's go on. That's when he hit me with a surprise, and he said, okay, so again, he took my iPad, he drew on there a big cloud, and he said, you're flying directly into a thunderstorm. What are you going to do? The airport right here has an airplane disabled on the runway. The airport you took off from is now closed. Where are you going to go? So that threw me for a loop. Being that I was doing dead reckoning pilotage, I started pulling up my iPad, trying to figure out the heading, all this kind of stuff. And then I asked him, I said, am I allowed to use the GPS here? And he said, yeah. So tuned in the Kissimmee airport. May not have been the best choice, but in that situation, I just wanted a heading really quickly. So I tuned into Kissimmee. And they said, what heading are you going to? What heading are you going to? Got me a little flustered. And without, I'm looking at my iPad without realizing that it's right there on the GPS. So finally looked up, I was like, there it is, I can't remember what the heading was, but 185 or something. And I'm like, okay, there's my heading. I said, perfect, turn to that heading. So I, made the turn, got on my heading, at which point he asked, how far is it? How long is it going to take us? Do we have enough gas? So I pulled up my little computer app, or my iPad app, and I calculated, we're 38 miles away. It's going to take us 35 minutes. Fuel required was 6 gallons, something like that. And I just told him, we've got full tanks, so totally going to make it. It's going to be about a half an hour. He said, fine, move on to the next one. So at that point, he had me set up for west heading. He said, all right, slow flight. Let's see slow flight. So I got set up for slow flight. Everything was great. And then he said, what'd you forget? And it's my clearing turn. I forgot my first clearing turn. So he didn't really ding me on that because, I was already on that heading. So I wasn't doing anything crazy, just slow. So then he had me do my steep turn. So did my clearing turn for the steep turn. And my left steep turn has always been the worst one, so I figured let me do that one. I didn't know if he was going to have me do both. So set up, took my time, just told him I'm trying to get to this speed and this altitude, this heading before I start anything. So I got there, did a clearing turn first, did my steep turn. Wasn't great, but it was acceptable. He did ask, he's like, were you looking out the window? For traffic? And I said, yeah, I was looking out, looking at the horizon, looking out the front window. So that was good. He did mention, he asked me, did you see that airplane? I said, yeah, I saw it. He's like, you got to call it out. You got to tell me that you saw the traffic. Okay, lesson learned. So steep turn was fine. Went and did my stalls, both of those. I kind of walked through. This is, I'm getting down to landing configuration, going to get into a stall, recover. The power off stall was great. Power on stall, same thing. It was just kind of slow the airplane down, full power. Told him, going to give it full power and point it to space. And he's like, well, not that drastic, but got up there and it's, was doing its buffering. And, he said what I've heard before with these Pipers, he's like, that's all you're going to get out of it. It's not going to really fully stall. So recovered from the stall. Then he asked me, he's like, all right, put on your foggles. We're going to, do some instruments. And I don't own foggles. So it's like, that took me by surprise. I was like, I don't have foggles. And I said, can I use my hat, the brim of my hat, as a hood or anything? And he said, nope. He said, that's part of the test. You're supposed to have those foggles with you. So that, my heart sunk. I thought that was it. But he's like, luckily for you, I have a pair you can borrow. So he, gave those to me. Got my foggles on unusual attitudes. So the first one, he kind of put us in a really nose up attitude. I started the recovery. I didn't give it full power. So he did mention that. He's like, you got to give it full power there. The Next one, it was kind of a dive, so killed the power, recovered, everything looked good there. Moved on to ground reference. So, you know, I've been doing these at about 800 feet. And he asked me what the ground was there. I said, it's about 100 feet. And he's like, okay, so take that into account. So I ended up doing my reference at about 1,000 feet. And it was really just the turnaround a point. So he just said, pick a point, do your turnaround a point. So I told him, here's where the wind's coming from. I'm going to fly out a little bit, come in from the downwind. Did my turnaround a point. Looked great. So he said, continue. We're going to climb up a little bit, about 3,000 feet. At which point he said, show me an emergency descent. So just pitched the airplane down, killed the power, about 120, 125 knots, emergency descent for a little bit. Once that was done, he told me to start flying back to the airport. So I started that, and then boom, killed the power. Your engine died. Now what? So I found a field really quickly. I said, I'm going to go for that field. You know, I was going to go directly into the wind for the landing. I was still pretty high at that point over the field, so I, just did a 360 turn, put in some flaps. I put in, I think, a couple notches of flaps before I made my turn, and then as I was making the final turn, I put in the final notch of flaps, and we started sinking really fast. And he's like, are you going to make it? Are you going to make it? He did tell me if at any point he felt unsafe, he was going to grab the controls, and that's it. I failed. Luckily, even with those flaps and the sinking that was happening, I felt and he felt that we would make it. So he let me continue. He said, all right, recover. So recovered from that, and he said, all right, take us back to the airport. We'll do some landings. So through that, the GPS, even though I knew exactly where the airport was, just to show, I know how to direct myself to the airport. Told him I was going to enter the 45, got on the right frequency, all that kind of stuff, and started making my calls. As I'm coming in towards the airport, somebody's taking off. One of the problems with the area we're in is we have 2 to 3 airports all in the same frequency. So people are calling, turning left base, but they're not announcing what airport. So I'm trying to find these planes, but it's at a different airport. People are taking off, kind of cutting right across where we're flying. They're going into the practice area where we have a lot of traffic. I'm pointing out airplanes, traffic, and somebody taking off was coming right behind us, pretty close as I'm turning into the 45. So I had to kind of abort that, turn back to the south, lose a little altitude, got into the pattern, and he told me to do a soft field landing. So came in, got the weather as I'm coming in, and it had gone from I think an 6 to 8 knot crosswind when I left to gusting to 17 to 18, something like that. So it was suddenly challenging with a lot of wind gusts and strong wind gusts directly across the field. So set it up. As I'm coming in, I was a little high, so I told him, I'm going to do a slip. So I did my forward slip there just for, maybe 5 seconds, 10 seconds at the most, just enough to lose a little altitude and a little speed. Came in, did a great soft field landing. Nose was way off the ground as I'm rolling, kept the yoke back all the way, taxied off, cleaned up the airplane, and then started taxiing back to do my soft field takeoff. He asked me if I wanted to continue. And I told him, I was okay with it. I said, I'm okay with taking off, concerned a little bit about the wind and the landings. So I asked him, I said, if I discontinue and you have to come back, is there another charge, all that kind of stuff? He said, no, but if you fail it, there is. So by that time, kind of talking through all that, I was all the way at the end of the runway, or the end of the taxiway again, ready to take off. And I told him, you know, I'm going to discontinue. And he's like, that's, you know, good choice. One of these things, it's like your external pressures. He's like, so now you have the pressure of finishing. You have the pressure of, are you going to spend more money? I said, so you know, made a good decision. And he told me he's failed people before because, you know, they're ready to go and they fly out directly into a thunderstorm because they want to get it done. And so that's a bad decision. So taxied, you know, I basically used the runway for a taxiway, taxied all the way back to the hangar, shut it all down, and went and did kind of a real quick debrief with him. And, you know, that was it. He set me up for about an hour flight a week later. So next week I have to go out and do 2 takeoffs, 2 landings. He did the paperwork kind of showing that I've successfully completed all these steps. So I have a week to go and practice some landings, and, you know, got to take off twice, land twice, and then I'm done. So I'm, you know, go out, practice, and I know that he's got some other exams coming up here. So if the stars align and he's got something done early and I happen to be there, I might do it early. But at this point, that got most of my check ride done. So feeling pretty good. 2 more takeoffs, 2 more landings, and hopefully I will be a pilot. So that's it. Thanks for watching.